There's a killer on campus. And let me guess. This killer is offing people based on urban legends. Yeah, that's right.
The consensus amongst critics and academics alike is that Scream rejuvenated the slasher by introducing self-reflexivity into the subgenre. It's also broadly agreed that one core aspect of that reflexivity is intertextuality. Scream has been dubbed a meta-slasher because it refers to other slasher films.
This is standard horror movie stuff. Prom Night Revisited, man.
Yeah?
And many critics have suggested that intertextuality isn't just a stylistic feature, but is Scream's major addition to the traditional formula of the slasher film. However, it should be noted that those intertextual references are quite often superficial. They just basically amount to name-checking other films. And that became something of a convention within the slasher film during this sort of 1990s to early 2000s period.
Greg, I know what you did last summer.
Naming other films became a way of commercially aligning one production with the success of the bubble of films surrounding Scream at the time. One clear example is Urban Legend. In the DVD commentary, Silvio Horta and Jamie Blanks both acknowledged that Scream had become, at the time, the contemporaneous standard by which slasher films would be judged, and that Urban Legend wouldn't have been made without Scream's success. They also expressed frustration at the unfavourable comparisons that followed, since they hadn't really intended Urban Legends to be like Scream.
They're going to go back to Scream a million times with every
Sure.
movie. It's set the standard, and we're like, oh, but it just wasn't Scream. You know what? We didn't intend this movie to be like Scream.
I never
we intended
saw
it to be
Scream.
its own.
Actually.
Well, you're not a horror movie fan, are you?
Scream was a wonderful
kidding.
movie, and all the credit in the world for them for opening the gates to allow movies like this being made. But it's a little frustrating when you're always being compared to that.
And that reputation is clear in some of the reviews for Urban Legend, which refer to it as a would-be postmodern slasher, or a knowing horror flick, or an unscary, unfunny knockoff that wants to be Scream. What I want to argue here is that the dismissal of Urban Legend overlooks what it's actually doing. Its intertextuality operates at a more fundamental level than the comparisons to Scream acknowledge, overlooking the ways it's operating beyond simply name-checking other films. Let's begin by acknowledging that Urban Legend does participate in that kind of surface-level convention that the postmodern slasher was known for. For instance, Blanks notes that he deliberately embedded allusions to earlier films within Urban Legend.
As a first-time director, and a lot of this stuff was really exciting because here's a shot that I wanted to pay homage to The Hitcher. I do this a little bit in the movie. There's some of my favorite movies that I'll occasionally have a little shot that's a homage to a certain movie.
The casting is also densely intertextual, so the film includes Danielle Harris, who most famously at that time had starred as Jamie in Halloween 4 and 5, Brad Dourif, who was the voice of Chucky in the Child's Play series, and Robert Englund, who played Freddy Krueger in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Those cast members and their established personae are deployed in different ways in Urban Legend. So for instance, Harris plays against type, moving from child star protagonist of the Halloween films to a sexually active, misanthropic goth.
Pause, do you mind please? What?
In contrast, Robert Englund and Brad Dourif lean into their established personae. So Englund plays a creepy professor.
Mind your children, or harm will come your way.
And part of the purpose of casting Englund in that role is to misleadingly present him as a suspect. His previous credentials as Freddy Krueger means he has to do very little to sell that idea. Dourif instead plays a gas station attendant who is positioned from his very first appearance as a potential threat. So in the opening scene, we see a driver, Michelle, pulling into an isolated gas station at night and lightning's flashing, and it's a stereotypical horror scenario. And during the scene, we stay inside the car with Michelle and we watch her perspective on the events and her clear distrust of and anxiety about Dourif's character. So every element of the scene, from his performance to the mise-en-scène to her reactions, all position him as being the point of threat. And the intertextuality, his prior associations with the slasher subgenre, only underline those connotations.
Freak show.
Eventually, too late for Michelle, There's a reversal when we find out he was trying to warn her about the killer concealed in her back seat. And her misperception of him, which is deeply rooted in stereotypes and the connotations surrounding the horror genre, have all inhibited his ability to save her.
Someone's in the back seat!
This opening scene sets the tone for Urban Legend, clearly signalling to viewers that expectations will be undercut throughout the film, and that agenda will be especially visible to anyone who already recognises Dourif from his prior appearances in the genre. But Urban Legend is self-reflexive in a much more fundamental way than any of this intertextuality captures. The film's much more concerned with the mechanics of storytelling itself.
It's like someone out there is taking all these stories and making them reality.
Urban Legend is intertextual because it's fundamentally a story about other texts, other stories.
Well, that really happened to a girl in my hometown.
Oh, yes, I'm sure it did. I'm sure most of you grew up thinking that this happened to girls in all your hometowns, but it didn't. You see, the babysitter and the man upstairs is what we call an urban legend. Contemporary folklore passed on as a true story.
Urban Legend's repeated, circulating folk tales are the basis for its narrative about the powers of storytelling. And that's the primary way in which Urban Legend, the film, is self-reflexive. The main conceit of the film is that the killer, Brenda, doesn't simply commit murders, she stages each one as a deliberate recreation of a specific urban legend. A particularly vivid example of that is when Natalie's roommate Tosh is murdered. Earlier in the film, Tosh berates Natalie for entering their room and turning on the light while she's having sex.
Shut off the fucking light!
Sorry.
Later, when Natalie returns while Tosh is being murdered, Natalie mistakes the sounds of struggle for sexual moans and she goes straight to sleep with her headphones on.
Sorry. Not looking.
And the next morning she finds Tosh's corpse and a message scrawled in blood on the wall. Earlier that very evening, Natalie flicked past the same image depicting exactly the same scenario in an encyclopedia of urban legends. That conceit itself was treated as a gimmick by many critics. And we could also even read the premise itself as being an intertextual reference to other slasher films. Urban legends have provided source material for other slasher films. So, for example, in I Know What You Did Last Summer, the protagonists sit around a campfire and recite the urban legend of Hook Hand.
This lunatic killer's escaped from an insane asylum. He's got this long, sharp hook for a hand. Right?
Dude, you're telling it wrong.
Shut up.
And the killer in I Know What You Did Last Summer uses a T-shaped pulling hook. Scream 2 equally drew on urban legends, telling the story of the killer hiding within the house. That scenario itself is part of the slasher film's history, being evoked in films such as When a Stranger Calls and Black Christmas. So in one sense, Urban Legend as a film is amplifying a trend that is already an established part of the slasher subgenre.
The call's coming from inside the house. Could it be an urban legend?
However, previous films use urban legends as the raw material for horror set pieces. What distinguishes urban legend is that the process of storytelling and myth-making is itself a fundamental part of the narrative. The film self-consciously refers to that process while enacting it. What I mean is that the relationship between urban legends and the film's events is not a gimmick, it's the foundation for Brenda's killing spree. Earlier in the film, Natalie and Sasha are consulting a book of urban legends, and they read about an initiation ritual in which gang members drive without their headlights and pursue and kill the first driver who flashes them in warning. Sasha speculates that this is definitely not a myth. She's unaware at that point that Natalie knows that it really isn't a myth, because it emerges that while at high school, Natalie and her friend Michelle were driving at night, and as a practical joke, Michelle turned off her headlights and chased the first driver who flashed them in a replication of the fabled urban legend.
I was laughing too at first, but then we started going really fast. I wanted to tell her to stop, but I just sat there. And then the other car lost control and ran off the road.
The driver in question was David, who then crashed and died, and David was Brenda's fiancé.
His name was David Evans. The one you and your friends decided to have a little fun with that night. You know, David and I were going to get married that summer, right after graduation.
The actual enacting of an urban legend then triggers Brenda's murder spree and equally shapes her method. She imposes urban legends on others in direct response to her fiancé dying within an urban legend. What really elevates Urban Legends the film, however, is that before the characters are even aware that the murders have begun, their world is already constituted by stories and storytelling. The film emphasises that by bookending the narrative with two different fireside storytelling sequences. Towards the start of the film, Brenda asks Parker to tell the story of the Stanley Hall massacre.
Right. So, this guy, he was a professor on campus maybe 25 years ago.
What did he teach?
I don't know, physics or some shit.
Abnormal psychology.
Another character, Paul, then corrects details, signalling his own familiarity with the urban legend before dismissing it entirely.
Parker, let me get this straight. When this happened 25 years ago, you were a sophomore.
It's funny.
Well, it's a bullshit story you hear on every campus in the Northeast.
Thank you. I mean, where's the proof?
However, the tale's basis in truth is confirmed later on when Paul, an investigative journalist, uncovers a news article revealing that their professor, Wexler, who appears in the film as a character, was the sole survivor of the Stanley Hall massacre. So the opening scene presents an urban legend that, within the film's context, is then demonstrated to be true. Paul's position as a journalist and therefore an arch storyteller, supposedly one with facts and truth on his side, is also underlined when he learns the truth about the Stanley Hall massacre itself within a piece of journalism. The opening storytelling scene is then echoed at the close of the film. Believing that Brenda is dead, Natalie reflects on what's happened and comes to the realisation that the story itself that she's been living through will also become an urban legend.
This will become a legend too, you know. It'll change a little from person to person, of course.
In the next scene, that concern is confirmed. A storyteller on a different campus in a near identical setting to the opening finishes recounting the events of the film we've just seen.
Thing of it is, they never found the body.
And just as Paul did earlier, the listeners laugh it off as another urban legend.
Bullshit.
Happened right here at Ashton. I swear to God.
Yeah, it's a stupid story here at every campus in the Northeast.
Exactly. I mean, where's your proof?
So the new legend has already spread, and it's already attracting the same kind of skepticism that the Stanley Hall massacre story was greeted with.
Yeah, and you know what? Natalie. She's my old roommate's cousin.
And Brenda's a girl in that Noxzema commercial.
Rebecca Gayheart, who plays Brenda throughout the film, then appears among the listeners, and she's the only one who takes the story seriously.
I believe you.
Thank you.
But you didn't tell it right.
I didn't.
And she begins to revise the account.
Okay, listen up, guys. Because this is how the story really goes.
The end credits then roll. So the film concludes by repositioning its own narrative as a new entry in the urban legend tradition, a story that's been circulated and mutates in the retelling. In this case, the originator has presumably survived to contest the retelling of that story. Brenda made her motive explicit in the climax, saying to Natalie,
You used an urban legend to kill my boyfriend, Natalie, and now?
Don't you want to be an urban legend? All your friends are now.
Her broader impetus seems to be to create an urban legend. By the end of the film, we find out that she's not only succeeded in authoring that kind of story, but she's also on hand to distribute and shape that story as it evolves. The ending also invites an alternative reading. The closing scene might not be showing us that Brenda survived, it might be that the events of the film are just a visual rendering of the storyteller's telling of the urban legend. In that case, it's not clear how legitimate the preceding events have been. They might have some basis in reality, or they might be entirely fictitious. Rebecca Gayheart might still be playing Brenda at the very last scene of the film, or she might be playing an altogether different character who simply offers another version of the urban legend. The film doesn't resolve the tension either way, and that lack of resolution itself is true to the logic of urban legends, which characteristically contain some potentially true aspects, but which are ultimately always ambiguous about their status as real or fictional. All of these ambiguities amplify the sense that urban legend as a film is also contrived, but they also leave open the possibility that the hyperbolic version of events that we've seen might have some basis in truth. At the same time, the film's constant retreading of familiar urban legends signals the opposite as well, that, like those legends, this film is not to be taken as being real or true. So urban legend is double-coded. Its characters inhabit a world that's shaped by stories, but they also, of course, are occupying a fictional world, and everything about their existence is a contrivance whose only purpose is to tell another story. The thing that makes urban legend interesting is that it's constantly making those conditions visible rather than trying to hide them. That combination of intertextual referentiality about storytelling and self-reflexivity about storytelling is unusual amongst postmodern slasher films, and as one of the higher profile films to follow in Scream's wake, it may well be that its approach has helped to anchor the very assumption that I began with, that slasher films of this era were particularly concerned with intertextual self-reflexivity. One thing I do hope to have underlined here is that urban legend shouldn't be written off as simply a Scream knockoff. Its contribution to the subgenre is more interesting than that reputation would suggest.